It's all about leadership. It is the leadership of the company that needs to prioritize and create a sales focus. I believe that organizations are successful when they are sales centric. There are arguments out there where people say, well, they have to be customer centric, which is correct, but companies only generate income when somebody is selling. Business ownership, the CEO, the founder needs to create a sales-centric culture where everyone understands that everyone ultimately services clients, and as a way to get there, services sales. If you are the director of sales, the VP of sales, the chief sales or chief revenue officer of an organization, your job is to make sure that salespeople don't make mistakes. Whatever mistakes they're making is lack of leadership. If they're not cut out for the job, if they're an ill fit, guess who hired them? If they're not following a sales process, guess who's responsible for ensuring that a sales process is followed? It's all about leadership.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun about all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi, I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to the Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today, Jeff is interviewing Henning Schwinum. Henning is the co-founder and managing partner of Vindux LLC. Vindux helps companies grow sales leadership capital by matching them with the sales leader and team necessary to transform their sales strategy, increase revenue, and move their business to the next level. Vindux uses a proprietary perfect match system to identify the ideal sales leader matched to their client's unique business requirements with the highest level of precision and assurance. Previously, Henning had been the head of global product management for Bayer AG in Germany and had been the vice president of global sales for Novadex. You can learn more about Henning at Vindux.com. That's VENDUX.com. Let's listen as Jeff talks to Henning.
Henning, I'd like to welcome you to the Corporate Couch today.
Thank you, Jeff. Great to be here.
Yeah, I assume you were born in Germany, and so if that is the case, you're our second non-U.S. born guest on the podcast. So
my honor, and I can say not only born, but born and raised in Germany. That makes it even worse.
Yes, and we'll get to your college experience, and most times I could really understand where somebody went to college because it's usually, a KU, New York University, but we're going to dig into a little bit of your college experience because based on your LinkedIn, I'm not sure.
Or the lack thereof.
All good, all good. Yeah, I'd like to start with a fun question just to kind of kick things off. We've been in the pandemic a little over 3 years now, and Zoom, just like we're conducting this podcast interview, been part of our lives now, mainly corporately, but there's some, friendships that have been, people have reconnected via Zoom that they don't live nearby. But what's the craziest attire you've seen someone wear during a professional Zoom call, or lack of attire?
Wow, that's an interesting question. From an attire point of view, I don't think I've seen crazy. And I do 8, 10, 12 Zoom calls a day, and been doing it for the last 3.5 years. But I've not seen crazy attire. What I've seen are crazy backgrounds, where people don't blur, don't use a virtual background, and you can tell that you're sitting in their bedroom.
Right.
You can see the bed, made or not, in the background, and that to me is a little awkward, is a little eerie. I really don't need to see that.
Yes.
And so I mean, I try to create as you can see, the audience won't be able to see, try to create a somewhat personal but yet professional background, and spend quite a bit of time in arranging pictures and furniture to make it look, like I said, professional, but provide a little bit of a personal insight, and then have conversation pieces or conversation starters in the picture. But from a Zoom perspective, attire has been all over the place, but nothing too crazy. Backgrounds for sure.
So I have to ask, on the data point of beds being made or unmade. What is the percentage of unmade beds in the background, just based on your observation?
Let's say too many.
Okay. We had one guest say similar answer to yours, something like there was a bra hanging over the, like, chair or something like that in the
No
background.
comment.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so yeah, we talked about you growing up in Germany. So what did you like to do growing up as a child, Henning?
Oh, if you go way back, I love to play Lego and puzzle. So those things that introverts do, play, with themselves, by themselves, using pieces and building things, putting things together. That was probably my childhood in a nutshell. And it took me a while to get out of that introvert state and become more of an extrovert, and really appreciate meeting people and engaging with people.
Yeah, what was your process to do that, to become more of extroverted?
I attribute it to one life-changing experience, and that was my student exchange year, uh, in when I was 16. At the end of 10th grade, I went abroad for a year, lived with a host family, went to high school, um, and immersed myself in a very different culture. And that was back in 1982 in rural North Carolina, a town of 500 people, one intersection with a flashing red light on top. There was no one speaking German. So, in order for me to meet people and to engage, I had to learn A, the language, and B, I had to approach people and talk to them. And to me, in hindsight, that year really changed the direction of my life. It turned me from an introvert into who I am today. I would still not label myself an extrovert, but I really enjoy meeting people, and I really like to meet new people, again and again and again, find out what they're all about, ask questions, learn from them, and put that all together, and all of that, influences me in my life. All these different experiences of meeting people, helps me shape my life, as I learned from those conversations. So it was that one life-changing experience as an exchange student in a foreign country. And as a side note, I still, 40 years later, yeah, 40, wow, a big number. 40 years later, still support the idea of student exchange by being a volunteer for a student exchange organization. Right now, I have two students, one from Japan, one from Denmark, here in our county that I'm counseling, and we're looking for host families. So anyone listening interested to host, contact me. I'd love to share the benefits and the growth opportunities for a family and a community that comes through hosting foreign students in your home.
So growing up, what were your aspirations, to be as an adult? A lot of people will say teacher, U.S. born. People will say, President of the United States or something, sports. What was your dream?
Well, the first aspiration I had, and I would say as a child and maybe even an early teen, was to be a captain of a seagoing merchant ship. I just thought the idea of being out at sea for weeks and months and commandeering a ship was something that I would really enjoy doing. So that was my first aspiration. And part of it was driven by the fact that my dad, ever since I can remember, has been a sailor. And I very early on joined him on these trips, learned from him, and eventually, developed and grew my own skills in sailing, chartering boats. And that did away with the idea of doing it as a profession. Then sort of in my teens, I wanted to be a diplomat. I liked the idea of being out there and bringing people together. And especially in and around my student exchange year, I felt that, I saw the value of bringing people together and learning from each other. And so I felt that I should make that my profession. It never came to that. I eventually ended up entering the commercial world, and once I was in a business, I shaped my career within that. And as I said earlier, I still support the idea of student exchange by being a volunteer for a student exchange organization.
Yeah, I love that. We very close friends of ours hosted a Italian male during his senior year in high school here. So it was about 9 months, and just a great kid. And yeah, I think it's a great program. So
It is. It's a wonderful experience. I mean, I could talk for hours about what it brings into a family. We also, as I was growing up, we hosted a student. One of my sisters went abroad. One of my kids went abroad. And I truly believe that if you do this at that age, that it really shapes the individual, but it also allows you to become part of a family. It's different when you're older, when you do it as a university student, or if you do it as an au pair, or if you travel. Those are good experiences, but they are different. When you're 16, 17, you're mendable, you can learn, you're open to learning, actually, and you can become part of a different family. And 40 years later, I still have my German mother, my birth mother, and I do have an American mom that I call mom, and I have American siblings, a sister and two brothers that I refer to as my American brother or my American sister.
yeah, that's very cool. I think, and obviously I did not experience, but it seems like you just assimilate more into the culture when you're, at that age and actually living, 24 hours a day, with a family of a different nationality, different country.
Right. I mean, you could say that you don't have a choice but to do it, because you're not there for a week as a visitor. You're there for almost a year, and you become part of the family. If there is something not right, if you were to see yourself as a visitor a few months in, or if the family would treat you like a visitor, you just grow together and become a family. And I think that is part of what makes this such a unique and wonderful experience.
I assume they called high school in Germany. I don't know, but after high school, what was your journey after that to your first professional job?
Yeah, so Germany has a slightly different educational system from the US, in that only about 30% of all high school graduates actually go to college. The rest go into different types of apprenticeship programs. And so I did a commercial apprenticeship program with a chemical company, Bayer, and they looked at this training program to be equal to having a degree, a 4-year degree from a university in economics or in business. So a couple of things are different. The first one is you actually get paid while you're in this program as an individual. And so instead of you paying a college a lot of money to be educated, the company pays you to be part of their program.
Love that.
And so that's one thing. The second one is that you train very practical things along the way. And as part of this program, you go within the company through every one of their departments. So you spend time in accounting and in procurement and in sales and in marketing and in manufacturing and operations. And you learn all the ins and outs of the company along the way. So when you're done with your training program, you can actually start working for the company, as opposed to someone who comes in after completing college. They still need to go through some sort of trainee program in order to learn the ins and outs of a company and this specific company that they join. So those are the advantages. There are some differences and disadvantages. It's not as it is very focused on practical applications. It doesn't include things that the company doesn't consider to be worthwhile. So you get less of a broader education. It is very specific to the needs of the company. And so that's what I did. Took 3 years, and then I continued to stay with Bayer for another 12 or 13 years.
Yeah, wow. And we talked the first time we met over Zoom a week ago that we both had that Bayer experience. Yours was a lot longer than mine, but it was a great company. I enjoyed myself there and got to spend some time in Leverkusen, the headquarters, meeting with my global peers. So it was good. So you basically got your first job because you interned at Bayer, and then you became a full-time employee, even though you were still getting paid. I don't know if they call it an internship or training program or whatever, but it's an interesting model. And I taught at the University of Kansas for the first time this past semester that just ended last month. And, I think colleges in the U.S. need to change, and universities, they need to change their model somewhat. I mean, because there's so many different ways to learn now. So, how you experienced post high school is I think leads to some discussion on the future of the U.S. universities, I think. But that's for another conversation. So it looked like you did a lot of, supply chain, manufacturing. Tell us about your early career and your major learnings at Bayer.
In hindsight, looking back at that part of my career, I spent 12, 13 years, and basically every year to 18 months, my role changed, and I progressed through the organization and took on different roles. And a big piece was on logistics and supply chain. And it just turned out that that's an area I enjoyed, an area where, I did well, and therefore had increasing responsibilities in that, accumulating in a role where I ran a warehouse, ran a packaging facility for a $600 million business. And it was a fun experience. It was very rewarding. And my transition into sales sort of came in 2 steps. The first step was that at some point I was transferred into the US to run supply chain for a facility in New Martinsville, West Virginia, and to manage imports from Europe coming into the US. And at some point, someone thought that it would be a good idea for me to also experience sales. So they put me in charge of the eastern half of the US and Mexico. So I had a few salespeople and a couple of distributors to manage. And it was an interesting experience because it came on top of my supply chain responsibilities. And I had no prior experience in sales. So I'd never been an individual contributor before leading a business of several $100 million of sales. And I made my fair share of mistakes and had my fair share of learnings in that role. And the second and then final transition into sales came after something that was called e-business hit the industry back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And it's hard to even imagine what it was like, because at that point there was no know-how and no usage of the internet other than maybe some emails going back and forth. And I remember that I ran a supply chain team at the time, and GE came to Bayer and said, Bayer, we want to invite you to a meeting on our campus where we bring our suppliers together, and we want to hear from you what you're doing in e-business. And at the time, no one knew what that even meant. And my boss, who headed the division, thought that it had something to do with logistics. And so that's why he dropped it on my desk. And we made up something and went out there and presented, and apparently it was good enough, because within 10 months, that part of my job mushroomed from 5 to 80%. I had 3 full-time people working with me on e-business projects. And it was a phenomenal gold digger time where Bayer and many other companies were willing to invest money in order to not miss out on the 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 e-business ventures that would eventually end up being successful. And so that whole engagement led me to actually leave Bayer, join an e-business startup, and it was all about sales from then onward.
Yeah, so interesting, and so many different ways we can take this. But I'd love to hear about, so you're running, you moved to the U.S., which a lot of Bayer corporate people do to gain U.S. experience. So you go, and then who was responsible for putting somebody in charge of, half of the East Coast and Mexico in terms of a sales organization, where you have no sales experience? You haven't sold anything since selling, beer at
myself to the company.
Yeah, there you go.
I couldn't tell you why that happened. Well, a part of all of that is the companies, good companies, companies that take leadership seriously and that take employee development seriously, look at individuals and try to grow them and give them exposure to a variety of different areas, because I believe that's how you grow leaders. You don't grow leaders by keeping them in a silo. And I was fortunate enough that I was given a lot of these opportunities very early in my career, and I do believe, in addition to making a lot of mistakes, I also justified the trust by delivering results in the jobs that I had.
Yeah, so interesting. So, I mean, you have no sales experience, and of course you're going to make mistakes. And kudos to Bayer for having that mentality, right? Because, they saw you were a high potential employee for them. But what was your process to learn? So, you seem like a lifelong learner, and here you are, know nothing about sales, essentially. What was your learning process?
I wish I could sit here and say, this is my process, copy it and you'll be successful. Back then, in that stage of my career, I did not have a process. You know, maybe I did do something and learn something in order to be successful, but it wasn't based on a process. It's not like I could sit here and say I read 10 books, or I did this, or I took this online course, or I talked to these people. I do remember that on the one hand, I felt very confident because I knew the product and I knew everything that was happening on the inside. So when clients were asking questions about the product, about the delivery, the warehousing, the packaging, the different sources, I was very comfortable being able to address those questions. But I also remember that I was very nervous when it came to commercial discussions, for example, because I'd not ever engaged in those. And I'll share one story that I remember to this day. And so some of these things the world sometimes turns out to be really small. So I was selling iron oxide pigment. The two core applications for that is anything concrete that is colored in orange, red, yellow, brown, black, sound walls, pavers, roof tiles. That's all iron oxide pigment. The other main application is coatings. So a lot of paint formulations contain iron oxide pigment. And one of the new applications that came up was coloring of mulch. It's something very unique to the US. Many European countries don't even know what mulch is, but here in the US, we have it and we color it because we want consistent color in our front yards. And if they do it the cheap way and chop up old pallets and other waste wood, you need color so that it looks nice. And so we educated and helped a lot of companies develop their formulations so that they could color mulch and sell it. And we were a premium supplier at the time. Our pricing was high, especially compared to cheap Chinese imports. And so we were invited to this one mulch supplier or mulch client of ours who we had helped extensively with our technology. And as we sat down, the owner expressed his gratitude for our help, and then went on to say that he had an offer from a Chinese supplier for the same material at a third of the price. And the inexperienced me said, well, congratulations. Congratulations on finding this new supplier. We are not going to respond or match anything here. I just wish you all the best with your supplier. And then I got up and left. We didn't lose, I didn't lose my job over this. We did lose the client because he did go with the competitor out of China. And it was just a tremendous, sort of in hindsight, a tremendous learning experience for me because I was extremely ill prepared to properly address the situation. And we should have known beforehand that that's exactly what they were going to bring up. So in hindsight, it was just a lack of prep and a lack of understanding what this call was going to be about. Because, with prep, the question could have been addressed in a many different way, and the discussion could have taken many different directions. The fun part, and that's why I said earlier, it's a small world, the technical director of that mulch manufacturer, 2 jobs further down the line, ended up being a colleague of mine and a really good friend for the next 10 years. We just sort of drifted apart and then came back together. And, we both remember this meeting and this conversation. And like I said, a learning experience, not something I would say I'm particularly proud of. Um, it just showed me the value of preparing.
Sure. But do you think even if you were prepared, that client would have signed with you?
Well, in the long run, the whole story of the marketplace for this product turned out to go into a direction where um, Bayer, or later the successors of Bayer, were able to produce product in different places to different standards that was less expensive, and at the same time manufacturing cost in China went up, so that at the end there ended up being a level playing field again. The challenge at the time was that our product, we weren't just a premium supplier of the same product. We were a manufacturer of a product made to much narrower specifications, because it was product made for the coatings industry, or the construction industry, which needed much narrower specs. Because if you paint and then come back a year later and use the same paint again, it needs to match. When you pave a street and it doesn't work, that it needs to be consistent in the coloring, and even after 10 or 15 years it needs to be consistent. So it was just in mulch. I mean, how fast does mulch disintegrate? A year, two maybe, with the bleaching of the sun, and the disintegration of the wood. So the solution and the discussion should have been around product specifications and product quality, and what can we do to create less expensive product to broader specs, matching what our Chinese competitors were doing at the time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And what I love too is, there's, kind of two times, in your Bayer career, where you didn't really have a career plan. And I say that with no disrespect, but a lot of the guests on the podcast, things happen, and I'm a believer all things happen for a reason. But you get into sales, which you didn't have a plan to be into sales, and then you were in a time of innovation. I was at an internet startup during that boom period in the late '90s, early 2000s, and so you become an e-business expert. So you're a pioneer in the space, right? So it's very interesting from that perspective. So at that point, you get recruited away from Bayer to go to the startup, which I believe was Chemodex, or
Correct.
yeah.
And interestingly enough, Overland Park, Kansas is where the company was, and the business still is headquartered. And yes, they first came to Bayer when I was in charge of e-business, and sold us the idea of a search engine for chemicals. And we participated in the search engine. And then the founder, Bruce Yanni, came back a year later and said, if I was interested in joining and initially building the European business for him, which after some deliberation and a visit to Kansas City, I was.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about Jim Dodd, who I had worked with at Sprint, became president
Yes.
of the company, so I was very familiar with it. So, what were your key learnings there? Because you kind of morphed from Chemodex to Novadex, and then got purchased by UL, Universal Laboratories. So, tell us about that journey.
Well, there are a lot of learnings along the way. Um, Value of a brand, right? When you sell for Bayer, then that logo gets you in the door. When you sell for Chemodex, a startup out of Overland Park, Kansas, in Europe, that is not a door opener. Nobody knows the company. Plus, you are a small newcomer based in the US. Who knows how reliable you are and how long you'll be around. I also learned the value of stick-to-itiveness and being persistent and following a process, because it wasn't easy at the beginning to sell the service into a very conservative industry. The chemical industry is innovative on the product side, but very conservative on the process side, and especially if you consider they're not it's not a sales driven world. You build chemical plants for 30 or 50 years, and that's your horizon, your time horizon that you think about. Most of the volume chemicals are their cost are driven by utilization rates. So, the difference between, and I'm making these numbers up, 90 or 92% of utilization can mean the difference between being profitable or not. And so it's first and foremost about producing a certain volume of product in order to be profitable, and then thinking about selling as secondary. You just have to get rid of the product and sell it. and that makes the business successful. There is really not a thought of producing something for a client, for a specific client once the order comes in. If for many products that are produced in a continuous or semi-continuous process in the chemical industry. And so to go into that environment with a new way of marketing your products, having to push out the incumbents, which would be trade shows or trade journal advertising at the time, was a very long process. It just took a really long time to establish this as a viable marketing and sales support effort in the chemical industry. And so you had to stick to it, and just be very persistent in your approach. And many companies that I contacted very early on in the stage, it took them 3, 4, 5 years to become clients, because they were not willing to be first movers or even early followers or early adopters of a solution that they had not heard about.
Yeah, interesting. So in those early days, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently in the sales process?
Probably the one big mistake that I made is to spread myself too thin. So if you think of Europe, there are 20, 25 major countries that have somewhat of a chemical industry. And instead of visiting all 25, I should have focused on just a handful of countries with concentration. As an example, I traveled to Norway 3 times on business during the early years for one company and never ended up becoming a client. But it felt important to me at the time to show presence in the country and to be able to tell this client, hey, I'm traveling in your neck of the woods. Do you have time to see me? I mean, that was all pre-internet, pre-Zoom calls. So, you could call, but you wouldn't sell anything unless you were there in person. And so focus probably would have helped. Doing an exploratory trip, for example, to the UK, and then saying, I'm going to stay away from it because most chemical companies at the time in the UK were small. They were, even back then, UK focused, not globally focused, and therefore they weren't really good targets for us. So that's definitely in hindsight something that we could have done differently at the time. Major learning.
Yeah, excellent. I would say, both. I think sales professionals are both born and made, and I think you're an example of the latter, and which I think is actually it gives you more perspective because you had to learn versus kind of be naturally gifted at it. So I think it helps you become a better sales leader going the second way. But what in your opinion, Henning, is the biggest mistake a sales professionals make, or the most frequent mistake? What, in your opinion?
There are plenty,
Top three.
plenty of of mistakes. So let's not just put the focus on the sales professional. Let's look at it organizationally, because you don't ever have a sales professional sort of loosely hanging there and doing their own thing unless someone is letting them do that. So to me, and this is hindsight after 25 years in sales, it's all about leadership. And it is the leadership of the company that needs to prioritize and create a sales focus. So I believe that organizations are successful when they are sales centric. There are arguments out there where people say, well, they have to be customer centric, which is correct. But companies only generate income when somebody is selling the product or service that they're making. And in many companies, when sales is more of an afterthought, when sales is an isolated, siloed experience, and the rest of the organization is not sales-centric, that is a disadvantage. And so business ownership, the CEO, the founder, needs to create a sales-centric culture where everyone understands that everyone ultimately services clients, and as a way to get there, services sales, because sales is the interface to the client in most organizations. So that's one thing. And then sales leadership. So if you are the director of sales, the VP of sales, the chief sales or chief revenue officer of an organization, your job is to make sure that salespeople don't make mistakes. So whatever mistakes they're making is, in my opinion, at the end of the day, lack of leadership. So if they're not cut out for the job, if they're an ill fit, guess who hired them? If they're not following a sales process, guess who's responsible for ensuring that a sales process is followed? If they discount when you're not, when you shouldn't be discounting the product because it's detrimental to the business, guess whose responsibility that is? It's all about leadership. And these are the mistakes that I see salespeople make. They don't follow the process. They don't believe in the process. And I mean, and you can see it when you come to the end of a month or the end of a quarter, and they're desperately focused on 2 or 3 deals that they've told you that would come through, but they've told you that for the last 6 months. Those are the only things that they're focused on, instead of focusing on the entire funnel. And while they're looking to get these deals across the finish line, they also need to focus on bringing new opportunities into the hopper so that there is a continuous flow of opportunities in the pipeline. Discounting is another mistake. I mean, I get contacted by vendors every day, and most of them come in the door before I even know what the product is or the service by saying how cheap they are, how great a deal they're offering right now, how much less expensive they are to any current solution I might be using. It's all about price. It's never about value. And so I believe that discounting diminishes the value of the product. It sets bad precedent. It creates an expectation. And anyone who has ever tried to sell on an introductory discount will tell you that that discount sticks around. So I bought a new car. It came with satellite radio. The first year was free because it was part of the deal, and then they charged a rate. And then a year later, I suddenly noticed on my bill that they were charging 3 times as much. And when I called them, they said, well, yeah, it was an introductory discount. And then I said, well, I'm going to cancel the service. It's not worth what you're charging now. And then they were very quick to say, well, yeah, how about if we continue the same low rate for another year? It's just, it doesn't make sense. My value perception of that satellite radio provider was a certain dollar number per month and not 3 times that. So once you establish that, you'll never get it back up.
Yeah, my wife did that same process 3 different times and got the same introductory price.
So I have two more years to go.
At least. So you're at Bayer 12-ish years, Chemodex, Innovadex, UL for looks like another about 17. So 29 years. So you're loyal, to 2 companies. And then in 2019, you decide to start your own company. So talk about that thought process and what was your why behind that?
Yeah. So after 20 some years of leading sales teams, it felt old to me. It felt like I wasn't learning anything anymore. The discussions around achievement in sales that happen every week, every month, every quarter, every year, they're always the same. There's nothing new in it. The reasons that you get from a sales rep on why they didn't hit numbers were always the same. The arguments from leadership and management as to what we needed to do and why we needed to do it were always the same. And there was nothing new for me to learn. And at the same time, I felt I had learned enough to be able to help companies. When I was, for the most part, when I was selling for Chemodex, Innovadex, and UL, I was selling into sales and marketing organizations. So on a daily, weekly basis, I was interacting with sales and marketing leaders. And I looked at these interactions, and especially at the time when you had a lot of face-to-face meetings, you walk into a building, you register, you go into a conference room, there's a group of people, sales and marketing professionals for the most part, you have your meeting, your presentation. And so for an hour and a half, you get exposed to their culture and how they're interacting with each other and how they're equipped and, what is leadership like. And there were probably a handful or maybe 2 handful of companies that I walked out of and said, wow, I would love to work here. This is a great culture, a great atmosphere. The vast majority, in my opinion, needed help. They needed help in culture, in technology, in understanding of how to go about selling their product. And that experience led me to say, well, how about if I go out and help? How about if I become a fractional executive, an interim executive that comes in, helps, fixes, builds, and then moves on and does the same thing for another company? That was my game plan back in 2019. And I discovered 2 things real quick. The first one was I was not well connected enough. I had spent 25 years in the same vertical, chemical industry. I had not built connections to founders or owners or investors or board members, and those people who would decide whether to bring in a fractional or interim executive. And then I looked for an agent who could represent me, a matchmaker, and I could not find one. There were matchmakers out there that covered the entire C-suite, but that to me meant that they weren't paying attention to me, because sales leaders are not always C-suite executives. A VP or an SVP of sales is not necessarily a C-suite executive. And so with that in mind, I said, what I am missing, others must be missing too. A matchmaker in this space of sales leadership with a focus on fractional or interim sales leadership roles. And that's when I decided I was just going to build that matchmaker. I got together with a friend of mine who I had worked with before at Innovadex, who came in as a co-founder, and the two of us launched Vendux together.
Henning, how long did it take you to realize that you didn't have you were just in one vertical, chemical manufacturing, for so long, and kind of pivot with your business idea?
Not very long, maybe 4 weeks or 6 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because I was out there looking for opportunities, and it didn't take long to realize that. And I mean, especially that second step, looking for someone who could help me. If the difference is a few percentage points, I gladly pay somebody to bring me into an assignment. But there wasn't a matchmaker in place. So with or without my own connections, it was more the lack of a dedicated matchmaker that made me realize that if I were to pivot and build that's a business opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. So you're basically in the fractional CSO, VP of sales, senior VP of sales, chief revenue officer space.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people understand the fractional idea, but how do you define it, and why do you love this space?
Well, I spent pre-acquisition, 11 years with a startup business. And I am forever grateful to Bruce Yanni, the founder, that he stuck with me through those 11 years, because it was an 11-year continuous learning process where, I started out being the sales team in Europe. I hired people down the road. I, then helped expand into Asia and open up an office in China and then Latin America. So it was a continuous journey, taking the business from 0 to 10 million from, one country globally, into the global realm. And while I'm grateful for the experience and the learnings, in hindsight, it probably would have been better to fractionalize that and to say, I need someone with experience in China, and so I'm going to put someone in charge of that experience, of that expansion. I need someone to get the business off the ground. Let's get someone to do that. The European sales team is 3 or 4 salespeople strong. Instead of having a player coach, which I was at the time, let's have a fractional sales leader lead those sales efforts and take the rest of the money and get another sales rep on the team. So in hindsight, that 11-year journey could have been broken up into chunks. And I would argue that by doing that, you get a very focused approach. You bring in just the right amount of skill set and just the right amount of time, and with it the investment and cost for each one of those building blocks over an 11-year period. And that's what fractionalizing means to me. And I believe it leads to a better and faster growth journey. Because especially in the early phases, startups wait so long with the next hire until they can barely make it, because that next hire comes with a big price tag. And so they wait really, really long and then bring in a full person. And then that journey starts over again. And the better way is to go in small steps, go in increments. And you can bring in the skill set much sooner that way. And that skill set can have an impact much sooner. Plus, you're not waiting and spreading your existing resources so thin that they can't focus on what they're actually tasked with and what they're actually good at.
So when you're dealing with these CEOs and you can see you can add value to them, what is the profile of that CEO in terms of being open to fractional? What is that person like?
Well, it would be easier for us as a business if we were to be able to pin down that executive and describe him in its entirety for our own targeting purposes. The commonality across, whether it's a CEO, whether it's a founder or an owner of a business that we engage with, the commonality is that they have a problem in sales, that they're willing to admit to the problem, and they're willing to do something about it. And because it's a problem in sales, they come to us because they feel, they think, they've heard that we can help them. And then we have a conversation and we talk about, what is your current state of sales? Where are you looking to take the business in the next 3, 6, 9 months? What is missing today? And all of that then shapes an assignment opportunity. Sometimes it is not an assignment for a fractional sales leader. Sometimes we send them away and say, you need a fractional CMO and you need to talk to XYZ about it. Or sometimes we say, this is all operational. This isn't a sales problem. Your back office is the problem. You need to fix that first. But because it's sales and growth and revenue related, often the outcome of the scoping conversation is an assignment for a fractional sales leader. So the common thread is this process. And of course, at that point, the founder, owner, or CEO needs to be willing to bring in a fractional executive, a fractional contractor into an important role within the company. Because if their problem is sales and growth and the solution they bring in is a contractor that works 10, 15 hours a week for them, they need to believe that that person will be able to accomplish those goals. And one of the prerequisites for that is that the job at hand is truly something that can be accomplished on a fractional basis. And that's when we talk about the goals. It needs to be clear at that point that those goals can be reached by someone putting in 10 or 15 hours a week. If at that point it's clear that's never going to happen, right? This is a full-blown effort. We need, not one but 2 full-time people there in order to get to those goals. Then it's our job to say at that point of the conversation, this is our conclusion. And then it can go one of 2 ways. One would be to adjust the goals to be more fitting to a fractional role, or to say, okay, thank you, then let's find a full-time person.
And so you went from obviously starting it in 2019, I believe, in that time frame. So 4 weeks in, you decide, you need to pivot. And now you build almost like 600 independent consultants, principals under your logo as independent contractors. Like, that's phenomenal. So what was your process there, as well? What has the biggest learning been since you have had all these people working as independent contractors for you?
Well, it's important to be really clear in the communication, especially on the executive, on the contractor side, right? We're a matchmaker that brings together those contractors with companies. We need to clearly communicate on both sides, obviously, but when it comes to executive, we have a roster of 650 pre-vetted executives today. And I always use the phrase that we're in a non-committed relationship to each other. We're non-exclusive. My goal is not to fill an executive's schedule to the max. My role is that of a sales channel. And like every good sales organization, an executive selling their own services should pursue a multi-channel strategy, meaning we're never the only one. We don't want to be the only one. The executive should also be out there using their own network, growing their own network, actively networking. They should look at other channels. We're not the only one. We are the only one with focus on sales, but there are others out there with a broader focus. And so, as an executive, look at all these channels, be aware of them, and then choose who you want to work with. That is an executive's, a solopreneur's best bet, in my opinion, for creating a fully and consistently loaded work schedule. And our focus is more on the client side, because when we scope an assignment for a client, we really want to be able to find the one executive that can truly claim to be the perfect fit for this role. And that's, in my opinion, someone that has done almost the exact thing that the company sets out to accomplish before. And the exact thing doesn't mean just, I've been a VP of sales in chemicals, but I've sold to similar decision makers, a similar product or service along a similar length of sales cycle, similar deal sizes, similar type or focus of the sales process. So these are all things that define a sales scenario, and we look for someone who has done that particular sales scenario before. And with that, we feel that we're bringing the perfect match into the organization, and with it, the biggest chances of success.
Yeah, I just love the fractional model. I think it's definitely, as we talked about offline, I mean, I think the CFO fractional model is the most mature, but I think what you're doing is phenomenal. And to have 650, sales leaders, CROs, CSOs, VPs is incredible, and a testament to what you built in the last 4 years. Henning, I always like to help two different groups of people. So I ask great leaders like yourself their thoughts on one for the recent college graduates. So the person just graduated last month in May. They're looking at their first professional career job. And I know you didn't have the traditional U.S. college university experience, but what advice would you give them as they pursue their first job out of college?
Wow, that's a difficult question to answer. And you pointed out, especially for me, I think I'll wave a flag for sales here, because in my opinion, sales is a very professional role. It's an area where you can learn, you can grow, you can develop just as much as in any other role. It is not something where you just step in because you're great at talking to people. I mean, those days are long gone where that's the only qualification you needed to bring to the table, or being able to lie or cheat. It's a process It's a team sport. It's it uses data and technology, and so to me, it has to be viewed as something very professional. And I tend to cite reputational statistics that put doctors and nurses at the top, and salespeople tend to score really low on trust on any of those trust surveys. And I would hope that over time that changes, because the used car salesman is truly a thing of the past. They might still exist in some industries, but for the most part, if you're in B2B, if you're in tech, if you're in any manufacturing sales, it is everything I said before: process, team, data, technology, and with it has to come a very professional approach. So don't be shy to go into sales. That would be my message.
Yeah, that's great. I have not heard that piece of advice before, but I think it's phenomenal, especially what you say. It's not the the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s in terms of the sales process and having the gift of gab. That the buyer, the customer now has the power with all the information available, and they're much more mature in the buying process to even when they engage a salesperson to start talking to different perspectives, partners. So yeah, so the second group I like to help is the person out of college, usually is an individual contributor, but then they get a role where they're leading a team for the first time. And while everybody can be a leader, whether you're an individual contributor or have direct reports and a team underneath you, what advice would you give them when they actually get a team underneath them in an org structure in terms of their professional leadership journey?
Well, the simple answer is be a leader, not a manager. But of course, the devil is in the detail there. What does that even mean, right? To me, a manager is someone who merely executes existing processes, who goes through the notions that you're supposed to go through when you manage people. You have your one-on-ones because you tend to have one-on-ones. You have your sales meetings. You have your call listening. Whatever your company does, whatever the sales process requires, you execute those things because that's what you do as a manager. A leader is, to me, someone different. A leader is someone who is able to inspire, and who's able to generate trust, who's able to have people follow them, not because they have to, but because they want to. And you don't get there by executing steps. You get there by often taking a first step in doing something differently, by empowering, by showing empathy, by being a phenomenal listener, by taking time, even if your calendar doesn't allow you to take time, because it's about people. Leadership is about people. It's not about the product or the service or the revenue or the client or reporting up. It's about the people that you work with. And from my own experience, I tend to say often that you could have woken me up in the middle of the night and said, Henning, give a presentation on the Chemedex platform, and I would have been able to do that. It was so ingrained in me. The much harder part of leadership is the responsibility for people, and how do you do that? How do you engage with people? And there is a lot of great advice out there, and some good examples of what constitutes great leadership, especially in sales.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, Sprint had some great training. One of the things I never forgot, and I don't know if it's a quote from somebody famous or just it was an internal Sprint quote, but it was, you manage processes and you lead people. And you said both of those things, so I loved it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Henning, you're phenomenal. You're just love your career journey and what you're doing now with your company, and it's Vendux, right?
Correct.
And I love
Vendux is
that.
Latin,
Yep.
so
Go
not
ahead.
French.
Yeah, Latin. Yeah, so it's yeah, Latin, not French, and it's Latin. It's two different Latin words for sales, and then Dux is leader, right? So
Leadership.
sales leader,
Good.
leadership. Yeah, I love that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed having you on the corporate couch.
Thank you, Jeff, for having me. I enjoyed the conversation tremendously.
Yes. Have a great rest of the day. I just thought Henning had a fascinating career. He started out in supply chain logistics, whole college, and I'll put college in quotes, experience in Germany was phenomenal. But what I loved, besides his pivot from supply chain to sales, when I asked him the question about, what is the most common error you see with sales professionals, he really spun it and talked about sales leadership and having a sales-centric culture for a company. So I really love that piece. I had never really heard that perspective before. And I love what he's doing in the fractional space. I just think these startup companies, as Henning pointed out, they wait so long to hire a seasoned professional, whether that be sales, a chief revenue officer, a VP of sales, a CFO, a COO, a CMO, CIO. They just wait too long, and his business model to provide that with 650 professionals, and he focuses only on sales. I think that is just one of the growing industries that we'll see in the next several years. Joe, what was your take on the episode?
Yeah, it's all about leadership, and it has to start there with sales leadership was the point that he was making. So you don't have to wait until you're huge to exhibit sales leadership. You do that from the beginning. I'm tickled to death to be working on this podcast and getting such a wide variety of talent in a wide variety of industries. So this is the first time we've been in the chemical industry. I know absolutely nothing about the chemical industry. And so every word that he said about the chemical industry, I just hung on it because I just thought it was so fascinating. It was such a neat experience to learn about something that I'd never seen before or never had any connection with before. And the other thing, you already know that I grew up very, very isolated in a small town in northeast Missouri. And so I sometimes have the tendency to believe that the way that we do things here is the way that the world does things. And so I need to be reminded every once in a while, for instance, that the German post-secondary educational system is completely different than what it is in America. And I think we can probably learn a lot from that. The fact that not everybody goes to college, or not everybody's expected to go to college.
Yeah, it was the vast minority.
Yeah, vast minority, right. And in America, what are they trying to do? They're trying to make college free, so everybody will go to it. Well, all you're going to end up with there is 4 years of a bunch of people's time wasted and a bunch of money wasted because they shouldn't be there in the first place. They should
and a lot of beer pong tournaments.
And a lot of beer pong tournaments because everything's going to be on a pass-fail system or something like, the grade inflation that's going on in college now. So if that's the way that they do post-secondary education in Germany, they're doing something right because that worked for him. And another thing that I liked about that is that the company assumed the risk of the education, right? And they could terminate it if it was appropriate, or they could scoot him over somewhere else. So he could start out in finance, and then he could scoot over into sales, and he could scoot over into marketing, and he could scoot over into product development. He could do all sorts of stuff.
And he got paid for going.
And he got paid for doing it, right? But the company is the one that's accepting the risk. Yeah. Not the government and not the student. And as a result, then they get the reward because they get a devoted employee as a result. I was just amazed that that's the way that it worked out. It was a lot of fun to listen to him.
Yeah, absolutely. So based on Henning's conversation on the podcast, what leadership advice would you give the audience today?
We are going to go to the subcontinent of India, to the great philosopher named Rajesh Kuprapali, who one time said, that doesn't make up for the fact that I had to make chicken and rice with a vegan guy. Do you know what vegan chicken and rice is? Rice.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.